It was supposed to be just another routine court session, a minor theft, an elderly man accused of stealing a loaf of bread. But the moment he walked into that courtroom, everything changed. His clothes were torn, his hands weathered by time and hardship, his eyes filled with something deeper than guilt, pain, sorrow, and history. This man wasn't just a criminal. His name was James Walker, a forgotten war veteran, once a proud soldier who risked his life for a country that now barely remembered his name. The courtroom fell silent, not out of respect, but confusion. And then, something truly unexpected happened. The judge, known for being cold and unforgiving, rose slowly from his bench, not to condemn, but to honor. He stood in silence, his eyes locked on the man before him, and in that silence, something powerful stirred. This is not a story about crime. This is a story about humanity, about how sometimes, in the most unlikely places, we're reminded of who we really are and who we've forgotten. The heavy oak doors of the courtroom creaked open, letting in a gust of cold winter air, and with it, a man who looked like he had been pulled from the edges of time itself. James Walker stepped inside, his thin frame barely held together by a tattered army coat, 2 sizes too big, with frayed sleeves brushing his weathered hands. His boots were caked in dried mud, and his eyes, though sunken and tired, held a quiet intensity, like he had seen more than most men ever would. The buzz of conversation died instantly. Every head turned. But James didn't look up. He walked slowly, deliberately, as if the weight of his past clung to his shoulders heavier than the coat itself. He was not just a man accused of stealing a loaf of bread. He was a ghost of forgotten service, a man once hailed a hero, now reduced to a figure of pity and suspicion. At the front of the room, Judge William Carter sat in silence, flipping through the thin case file with practiced indifference, until he caught the defendant's name. His fingers paused. His eyes widened slightly. Slowly, he looked up, and for a brief moment, his expression faltered. His face, usually carved in stern discipline, softened with something unfamiliar, recognition. As James approached the defendant's stand, the room held its breath. The judge rose from his chair, defying courtroom protocol. Gasps rippled through the crowd. But the judge didn't speak, not yet. He just stood there, staring at the broken man before him, the wheels of memory turning behind his eyes. For a long, unbearable moment, the courtroom was shrouded in a heavy silence, broken only by the rustling of papers in the hands of Judge Carter, who appeared lost in the weight of the moment. His eyes hovered over the name in front of him, a name that once held meaning, a name connected to memories that hadn't been thought of in years. The atmosphere seemed to thicken with every second that passed, as if time itself was waiting for him to speak, to confirm whether he was truly facing the man he had not seen in so long. Judge Carter's gaze flicked briefly to James, the ghost of recognition flickering across his features, before he cleared his throat and spoke slowly, almost cautiously. "James Walker," the words came out as a whisper, as though testing the waters, as if saying the name aloud would bring something ancient, something deeply buried to the surface. It was a name that held too many connotations, too much history, and it hung in the air like a ghost that refused to rest. James stood motionless. His eyes, sharp and dark, betrayed no emotion, but deep within him, the shock of the moment sent a wave of old pain crashing through his chest. His lips pressed into a thin line, jaw clenched, but he didn't react outwardly. He had learned, long ago, to bury his feelings, to keep them hidden under a mask of indifference. The years of battle, of survival, had taught him to shut off anything that could be perceived as weakness, and yet, here, in this cold, sterile courtroom, all of that discipline was being tested. He could feel the rush of his heart beneath his ribs, the pulse pounding in his temples, but he held his ground. He wasn't here to show weakness. He wasn't here to feel sorry for himself, even though every fiber of his being screamed at him to turn and walk away. The judge paused, his eyes narrowing slightly as if he, too, was grappling with the weight of the past. You were a decorated soldier," Judge Carter continued, the words slipping out reluctantly, like a man repeating a truth he wasn't sure he believed in anymore. "You served with distinction. You saved lives." There was a moment's hesitation, almost like the judge was testing the words in his mouth, as though unsure how to categorize this man standing before him. The room seemed to hold its breath, the murmurs from the gallery dying down as everyone waited for the next word. But James felt his skin prickle under the weight of their collective attention. He wasn't a hero. Not anymore. Not in their eyes. He had long since shed the label of soldier, and it wasn't the accolades, the medals, or the memories of battle that defined him now. They were all just empty symbols from a life that had ceased to matter the moment he had stepped off the plane and returned to a world that felt foreign and unwelcoming. Inside, he was seething, though his face betrayed nothing. It wasn't the judge's pity that stung, it was the courtroom, the strangers' gazes, the disapproving whispers that clawed at his chest. He felt like a prisoner in his own skin. How could they all sit there, with their perfect lives, their perfect families, when they didn't understand the scars he bore? They had never felt the heat of battle, the thrill of surviving when it seemed impossible, or the weight of a weapon in their hands, knowing it was the only way to hold on to a fragment of control. His hand, clenched into a fist at his side, trembled ever so slightly, but he fought to keep it still. His breath hitched for just a moment, the urge to lash out nearly overwhelming him, but he kept his composure. The judge, as if sensing the tension in the room, continued, but his words felt distant now, almost irrelevant. "Your actions during your service, commendable," Judge Carter said, though his tone was growing strained. "But they don't excuse," he trailed off, looking down at the papers again, clearly struggling with the enormity of what lay ahead. James could feel his patience thinning. There was again, the assumption that the past could simply be compartmentalized, that it could be neatly filed away under service or sacrifice, as though none of it had consequences. But there were consequences, his own personal ones. The long years of being forgotten, discarded, and made to feel like a shadow of the man he used to be. As the judge prepared to speak again, James couldn't stand it any longer. The anger that had been festering inside him for years bubbled to the surface, threatening to spill over. But he stayed silent, not out of fear, but because he knew that if he opened his mouth now, it would all unravel, his shame, his pride, his fear. He wasn't ready to be exposed, not yet. There was still a flicker of something deep inside him, something that had once been hope, but now felt more like a distant memory. He swallowed the words, buried them deeper down. Not now. Not here. Not in front of them. The courtroom was silent except for the sound of James' own breathing, which seemed to echo through the oppressive stillness. His palms were clammy against the worn wood of the table, his fingers tightening in an instinctive attempt to steady himself. The weight of the judge's gaze felt like 1,000 pounds pressing down on him, each second dragging on, each breath a struggle to hold steady. The words Judge Carter had just spoken felt distant, like they were coming from a place he couldn't quite reach. They had lost their meaning, drowned out by the torrent of thoughts rushing through his mind, each one more chaotic than the last. The world around him was spinning, but he stood motionless, the full force of his guilt crashing over him like a wave breaking against the shore. He had been here before, back in that foreign country, in a moment that had irrevocably altered the course of his life. The thought of that day never failed to haunt him, no matter how far he ran from it, no matter how hard he tried to bury it in the corners of his mind. And now, in this courtroom, the echoes of that past were bleeding into his present, threatening to break him once and for all. He could see it all so clearly, the girl's face, pale and desperate as she clutched her baby to her chest, her eyes wide with terror. The desperation in her gaze had mirrored his own fear of what was happening around them, fear of what might come next. It was a fear that had gripped him that day, too, a fear that had turned his legs to jelly and made every decision feel like a life-and-death gamble. But in that moment, he had made the choice. He had decided to act. And now, years later, that decision haunted him more than anything else. The muffled sounds of the courtroom, rustling papers, quiet murmurs, faded into the background as the memory of that day unfolded in his mind. The frantic voices of soldiers yelling commands, the smell of blood and smoke filling his nostrils, the taste of fear that had settled in his mouth. The life-or-death decisions he had made in the heat of battle. What had he truly saved? What lives had he destroyed in his pursuit of what he thought was right? James' heart began to pound in his chest, a deep, thudding rhythm that matched the rising anxiety within him. His hands trembled ever so slightly, a nervous twitch he couldn't control. The faces around him, the judge, the prosecutor, the jury, were all blurry now. It was as if they were fading into the background, while his own inner turmoil took center stage. He wanted to scream, to let out all the words that had been locked inside for so long. But they wouldn't come. His throat felt tight, constricted, and the words seemed to get lost in the air. For a fleeting moment, he thought he might just leave. Walk out of that courtroom, leave behind the whole damn trial, leave behind the people who judged him without knowing the truth. But then he thought of the families, the ones who had been affected by his actions, by his decisions. He thought of the faces of the people he had sworn to protect, and it grounded him. He couldn't walk away. Not yet. Not when he still had a chance to make things right. James, Judge Carter's voice, calm but firm, broke through the fog in James' mind. His name felt like a rope thrown to a drowning man, pulling him back from the abyss he had been sinking into. Look at me. James forced himself to lift his eyes, meeting the judge's gaze for the first time since the trial had begun. There was something there, something that almost resembled pity in the judge's eyes, but James couldn't bring himself to accept it. He didn't want pity. He didn't deserve it. The people he had failed, those were the ones who deserved compassion, not him. Not after everything he had done. His hands clenched into fists once again, his knuckles turning white from the force. The pressure in his chest felt like it might crush him, but still, he remained silent. His jaw was tight, the muscles along his neck visibly straining. He didn't know what to say anymore. There was nothing left to explain. You think you understand? James muttered under his breath, barely louder than a whisper, but the words were sharp with bitter honesty. You think you can stand there and judge me when you haven't been in my shoes? His voice cracked, the rawness in it exposing a side of him that he had long tried to conceal. He could feel the emotions rising, anger, regret, fear, all of them rushing to the surface, fighting for dominance. The judge said nothing for a moment, letting the silence stretch between them. The entire room seemed to hold its breath, waiting for something. Waiting for James to break or for him to finally speak the truth. But James couldn't do it. He couldn't bear to put that truth into words just yet. Not when it would make everything so real. Instead, he dropped his gaze to the floor, his shoulders slumping as if the weight of the world was pressing down on him from all sides. The room remained still, but inside him, everything was unraveling, piece by piece. There was no escape from the past. And no matter how hard he tried to run from it, it was always going to find him. The courtroom felt suffocating, a heavy, oppressive silence that seemed to stretch out endlessly. James sat motionless at the defense table, his hands clenched tightly around the cold, polished wood as if he could somehow ground himself in the chaos of his thoughts. Every breath felt labored, each inhale shallow as though the air itself had thickened. His mind raced, but the thoughts never seemed to connect. The words he had rehearsed over and over again in his head now seemed distant, slipping away like sand through his fingers. What could he say? How could he possibly explain the unimaginable? His gaze drifted to the jury, their eyes fixed on him, some of them filled with skepticism, others with pity. There were no answers in their expressions, only a cold, quiet judgment. The jury was waiting. The judge, too, he could feel Mr. Harris's eyes boring into him from across the room, a silent reminder that time was running out. It felt as though the weight of everyone's expectations, of all the eyes on him, was threatening to crush him under its sheer force. Rachel, his defense attorney, sat beside him. Her presence, usually a source of calm, now felt like an anchor dragging him deeper into the storm. She had whispered a few words of encouragement earlier, but her gaze now was locked on him with an intensity that almost felt like a plea. "James, you have to do this. You have to face them. You have to face what you've done." The words stung like a slap to his face. How could he? How could he face them, when facing them meant confronting the reality of the choices he had made? Confronting the truth of a decision that had shattered lives? It was easier to remain silent, to hide behind the faceless walls of his own guilt. But he knew Rachel was right. It wasn't just the jury that needed to hear the truth, it was him. For years, he had buried it deep within himself, refusing to acknowledge the weight of his actions. But it was time. Time to admit what he had done, even if it meant shattering every illusion he had spent so long constructing. His chest tightened as the memory flooded back, sudden and overwhelming. He could almost feel the scorching heat of the desert sun on his skin again, hear the distant thrum of helicopters in the air, the faint rustle of the wind in the sand. He was there again, back in the moment that had haunted him every day since. The gun. The terrified faces. The screams of the civilians, the pregnant woman clutching her belly in desperation. He remembered it all with painful clarity. In that instant, he had done what he thought was necessary. He had fired first, instinctively, without hesitation. Protect yourself. That was the rule, the only rule in a place like that. But now, as the reality of his actions crushed down on him, it felt like that rule had betrayed him. He had failed. He had killed innocent people, taken lives, and for what? To survive? James' hands trembled, his palms slick with sweat as he gripped the edge of the table harder. His body was frozen in place, but his mind was a whirlwind, spinning with thoughts that made him want to scream, to tear everything apart. His head throbbed with the weight of it, and his vision blurred as if the room itself were spinning. He could still see the mother's eyes, the terrified, pleading look she had given him as the chaos unfolded. The image was seared into his memory, an image that would never fade. She had begged him for help, had begged him to save her unborn child. But all he had done was pull the trigger. All he had done was add another victim to the list of people whose lives had been destroyed by the war, by the very system he had been a part of. The guilt rose up like bile in his throat, suffocating him. His breath quickened, and for a moment, he thought he might choke on it. He could still hear her voice in his head, though he couldn't understand the words. It didn't matter. The fear in her eyes had been clear enough. He closed his eyes tightly, trying to block out the flood of images that threatened to overwhelm him. The pounding in his chest, the way his breath was coming in jagged gasps, made it feel as though the walls were closing in. His whole body felt like it was on the verge of collapse. James, Rachel's voice, soft and insistent, cut through the fog in his mind. Her hand rested gently on his arm, but it felt like a lifeline, something to hold on to in the midst of the storm. You have to speak. You have to tell them the truth. This is the only way you can begin to heal. He wanted to tell her it was too late. That it had been too late long ago. that the truth was a poison, and once it was out, there would be no going back. But the words wouldn't come. He couldn't bring himself to say them. Instead, he focused on her hand, her steady, calm presence, a reminder that he wasn't entirely alone in this. But it didn't matter. Because deep down, he knew what he had to do. He knew what the right thing was, even if it terrified him. James swallowed hard, and with great effort, he pushed himself to his feet. His legs were shaky, his knees weak beneath him, but he couldn't sit any longer. Not when the truth was sitting right there in front of him, begging to be spoken. He walked slowly, the sound of his shoes on the hard floor the only noise that filled the space. The jury's eyes followed him, some filled with expectation, others with doubt. He didn't look at them. He couldn't. He wasn't ready for their judgment. Not yet. Taking a deep breath, James turned to face the judge. His mouth was dry, and his heart was pounding in his ears, but he forced the words out, the words that had been trapped in his chest for so long. I made a mistake. I thought I was doing the right thing. I thought I was protecting myself. But I wasn't. I killed innocent people. His voice faltered, breaking in the middle, but he pushed on. I took lives. I can't change that. I can't bring them back. I can't undo what I've done. But I have to say it. I have to say it out loud. The room was silent. The weight of his confession hung in the air like a leaden cloud. His chest ached, his body trembling with the rawness of the admission. But it was done. The truth was out, and there was no going back. He didn't know what would happen next, didn't know how this would all end, but for the first time in a long time, he felt a small flicker of something that resembled relief. It wasn't forgiveness. That was something he knew he would never find. But it was a beginning. A beginning to a long, painful road toward redemption. James stood there, his heart pounding in his chest, the weight of his confession pressing down on him like 1,000 tons of stone. His mind was a chaotic mess of conflicting thoughts and emotions. Every muscle in his body felt taut, as if he were caught in a storm and couldn't escape the relentless waves crashing over him. His eyes were fixed on the judge, but he saw nothing, only the endless echoes of his own guilt, reverberating inside his skull. He had said it, the truth. But the truth, in this case, was a double-edged sword. The courtroom was unnervingly quiet, as if time itself had momentarily frozen. James could feel the eyes of the jury boring into him, their gazes sharp, calculating. Some seemed to judge him with the harshness of strangers, others with a touch of sympathy, though it barely mattered. He couldn't escape the knowledge that to them, he was a symbol of something much larger, something beyond him, beyond his intentions. In their eyes, he was guilty. The confession had sealed that fate. But it wasn't just their judgment that haunted him. It was the faces of the victims, the families that would never be whole again. The faces of people he had loved. His actions had taken them away. And now, standing here, he was forced to confront the irreversible consequences. Rachel's hand was still on his arm, and for a fleeting moment, he wanted to collapse into her, to let her absorb the weight of this moment, to carry him away from it all. But he couldn't. His body was locked in place, every part of him screaming to run, to escape the spotlight of public judgment. Yet, he stood frozen, unable to move, unable to speak. The realization settled over him like a thick fog, there was no going back. There was no undoing the past, no erasing the faces of those he had hurt. His past had become an inescapable cage, and the bars were made of his own choices. He could almost hear their voices, the people who had trusted him, the lives that had been lost because of a momentary lapse, a moment when his humanity had faltered. The judge, Mr. Harris, finally broke the silence, his voice cutting through the suffocating stillness of the room. "Mr. Carter," he began, his tone calm but unwavering. "You've spoken. You've confessed. But understand this, your words do not change the fact of what happened. They do not erase the harm you've caused. Do you fully comprehend that?" James' mouth went dry, his breath catching in his throat. "I do," he whispered, the words barely leaving his lips. He wanted to say more, to explain the overwhelming shame and regret that coursed through him, but he couldn't. There were no words that could bring back what had been lost. There was no apology that could undo the damage. Rachel, standing just slightly behind him, squeezed his arm in what he could only interpret as a gesture of support. Her grip was firm, yet he could feel the tremor of uncertainty in her fingers. She was struggling too. Not with the facts of the case, those were clear, but with the heavy burden of standing beside him as he faced what he had done. She had always believed in justice, in doing what was right, and now she was witnessing the consequences of that belief. She couldn't shield him from this, and that fact stung more than anything else. As the prosecution began to speak, laying out the grim details of the case, James' mind wandered again. The words seemed to blur together. He was hardly listening. The truth, the cold, brutal truth of what he had done, was all he could hear. Every sentence the prosecutor spoke felt like a slap, reminding him of the things he could never change. He had been a part of something so much larger than himself, something that had spiraled out of control, fueled by anger and fear. He clenched his fists at his sides, the skin of his palms raw from the pressure. His chest felt tight, like a vice was slowly tightening around his ribs. He wanted to scream, to release the suffocating pressure inside of him, but he couldn't. Instead, he stood silently, the weight of every word spoken in that room crashing down on him. James' thoughts were interrupted by the sudden realization that the entire room had shifted. The jury was now watching him more intently than before. Some had their heads bowed, others exchanged glances, and some even seemed to soften, if only slightly. The pressure in the air thickened, as though they were awaiting his next move, his next words, even though they already knew the truth. He had confessed. There was no turning back now. "James," Rachel said softly, her voice just above a whisper, but it was enough to pull him from the depths of his spiraling thoughts. "You've done the right thing. You've faced it." He wanted to respond, to acknowledge her, but he couldn't. His throat had closed up, as though his body was refusing to let him speak any further. Instead, he nodded slightly, the only thing he could offer in response. Her hand tightened on his arm, as if to reassure him, but even she couldn't hide the uncertainty in her eyes. His heart raced again, and he felt a wave of nausea wash over him. The truth was too much to bear, too much for any one person to carry alone. He had taken a life. He had taken lives. And no matter what came next, no matter the outcome of the trial, he would forever carry that weight. That knowledge would follow him for the rest of his life. But in this moment, as the room waited for the judge to speak, he allowed himself the smallest breath of relief. Maybe this was the first step. Maybe this was the hardest part. For the first time in a long time, he was no longer hiding from what he had done. He had confessed. And now, he had to face whatever came next. When the gavel fell, it wasn't just the end of a trial, it was the beginning of something deeper. James Walker left that courtroom not with a sentence, but with dignity. The judge's silent stand echoed far beyond those four walls. It spoke to the heart of a broken system and a society too quick to turn its back on those who once stood to protect it. James didn't ask for pity. He didn't demand justice. He simply stood there, letting his silence speak for every veteran abandoned by the very freedom they defended. There are thousands like James, living in shadows, forgotten by the world they once served. But in that courtroom, for one brief moment, he was seen. Not as a thief. Not as a problem. But as a man. A hero. A human being. If this story moved you, don't let it stop here. Share it. Remember it. Because the quietest moments often hold the loudest truths. And sometimes, the most powerful act is simply to stand in silence.